Okay, we've got a good number of people joining us now, so we'll make a slow start. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm delighted to be presenting this webinar on climate transition planning with our friends from Houthoff. My name's Sarah Jane Denton. I'm a director in Travers Smith's Environment and Operational Risk Group here in London. Travers Smith is a London-based law firm. We primarily specialise in asset managers and corporate advice across the globe. I'm a member of our cross-departmental ESG team and committee here at Travers Smith. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jacques Kroner, Ronnie Bloomberg and Maria Verwey from Houthoff, and I'll pass over to Jacques to introduce the team.
Wonderful. Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah Jane. Yes, welcome from the Houthoff side. We're very happy to be able to join up with Travers Smith on this seminar for this afternoon. I'm Jacques Kroner. I'm with Houthoff as a corporate partner and focusing on corporate governance and reporting, and now especially because everything that is happening and what we're looking at in respect of ESG regulation. And today I've brought with me, I'm very proud to present Maria Verwey on my left and Ronnie Bloomberg on my right. They are the environmental experts that are going to speak to you today as well. Maria, she's an environmental law expert and has over 15 years of experience in the field, in the steel industry. So we're very happy to have her here. And Ronnie, you on my right side, he's our climate change litigation expert. And that's also exactly what he's going to speak to you about today. So we're looking forward to this, and back to you, Sarah Jane.
Thank you very much, Jacques and the Houthoff team. So just a few moments of housekeeping before we really get started. We are going to be recording this session. We will circulate a copy of the slides and a link to the recording after the session. We will try to leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box in Teams, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. We will try to follow up with you afterwards. If you'd like us to do that, then please don't ask your question anonymously. Do let us know who you are, and then we can follow up with you directly. So on to the agenda for today. So we're going to start off by defining transition plans. What do we mean by a transition plan? We'll then look at the regulatory drivers behind transition planning. Ronnie will speak to us about transition plan litigation in the Netherlands. And then we'll finish off by looking at what makes a good transition plan. And as I say, we'll try to leave a few moments for Q&A. I do want to address one thing before we get started, and that is the EU's omnibus regulation. Now, I'm sure you know, but the EU sustainability landscape is in something of a state of flux at the moment. And that's thanks to the Commission's proposals, or just about to be proposals, to reduce the reporting burden on companies by 25%. And that means that they're going to be reopening the text of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and the Taxonomy Regulation. Now, we're going to speak about those pieces of legislation today, but we will reflect the current state of the law, mostly because, put quite simply, nobody quite knows what the Commission is going to do towards the end of this month or the beginning of next. So we thought best to reflect the law as it stands today. We will go over those again in a little bit more detail in a second. So let's really get started. So how do we define a transition plan? We're going to start off with a bit of a level set, because we're going to talk here about some concepts which aren't necessarily uniformly understood across industry. Now, let's start with net zero and target setting, because we're going to talk about that a lot during today's session. There's been quite a lot of criticisms of businesses. In the last few years, it's been a relatively easy win for people to choose a net zero target, to set that target, choose a base year, choose an objective year, and then proceed without necessarily having a really good plan of how they're going to achieve that net zero target. Now, that plan of how you're going to achieve the net zero target is the essence of what makes a good transition plan and what makes that net zero target credible. It's also fair to say there's a reasonable amount of trepidation around transition planning. I think that's partially shown in the interest that we've had in today's session. There's maybe a bit of a feeling that actually they're only really a useful tool and really a benefit to those who are already well on their way to tackling greenhouse gas emissions. But actually, I'd like to challenge that. I think they're actually a really good tool to demonstrate that even those people who have businesses where you face significant challenges around decarbonisation, it shows how those businesses can remain viable in the long term. They need the right tools and they need the right plans to achieve that transition to a low carbon economy. It might take a number of different forms. It might mean doing business slightly differently. It might mean doing slightly different business. It does give you the opportunity to present a more nuanced picture of where the business fits within the overall move towards a low carbon economy. And it also thereby gives stakeholders such as investors, even employees, confidence in your business. Now, that point I've just made about transition was underlined by the London Stock Exchange Group recently when it responded to the European Commission in response to the omnibus proposal that I just mentioned. The LSEG is actually recommending that the EU use its review of the Sustainable Finance Regulation to introduce a new category of climate transition fund. Under that, there would not be a blanket exclusion of high emitting companies, provided they've got a credible transition plan. It's really an acknowledgement that actually climate neutrality and Paris alignment is something that happens on a whole systems basis over time. There could right now be many high emitting companies that are making a really valuable contribution to the overall economy-wide emissions reduction. That can be seen, for example, in the manufacture of electric cars. Yes, right now they probably have very high emissions, but the positive role that they play in the systems transformation outweighs that singular high emission company. There's a lot of confusion around some of the terms we use when we talk about transition planning and climate mitigation. So for clarity, let's answer one question up front. And that's whether or not, in order to have a transition plan, do you need to have a net zero target? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, concludes that the need for a net zero target is borne out by the commitment of the world at large under the Paris Agreement to keep emissions and temperature rises below 1.5 degrees by 2050. So in essence, the IPCC's view is that yes, you do need to have a net zero target. Theoretically, you could continue to emit at a high level as of today, and you could balance your emissions with carbon removals or credits, but generally a credible net zero target requires you to reduce your emissions by between 90 and 95%, and then to only use removals or credits to balance the remaining residual emissions that you can't reduce any further. So all that said, back to the question of what is a transition plan? There are lots of words on this slide, and I don't necessarily need you to read them all because I'm just going to pull together some threads. We've got some of the key regimes that deal with transition planning set out on this slide. The only two of these definitions which are the same in essence are the IFRS, the ISSB definition, and CSRD. Now, obviously, given the number of companies impacted by those two regimes, that has to be good news. They have got some common themes. They all talk about transitioning the business to a low carbon economy. They're very often tied to a specific broader low carbon goal, such as net zero by 2050. They always mention targets and actions, and some also mention resources. They might be time bound, as I say, to 2050 or 2030, for example, and very importantly, they are always strategic. So on that note, I wanted to just show this graphic. This is from the TCFD. So I suspect you're all quite familiar with the TCFD. It's really the original climate disclosure framework from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, even though its work has now largely been subsumed by the newer ISSB, which we'll come on to. Now, this is how the TCFD wants you to think about your climate strategy and where transition planning fits within it. Overall, this is just one element of your overall business strategy. It's not separate to your business strategy. It doesn't sit alongside your business strategy. It's an integral part of it. Now, of course, in reality, the picture is much more complex than this. And of course, there are critical commercial and financial drivers. But this does underline how a successful transition plan should not be viewed as a side project to your main business activities. So looking now about the imperative behind transition planning, one of the questions we set out to answer in this webinar is why now? So we've got a few different things going on here. We're going to talk about the macro drivers behind transition planning. So regardless of where you stand on climate change, we have a consensus amongst around 97% of scientists that the climate is changing thanks to man-made drivers. The graphic on the right-hand side of the slide here are called the climate warming stripes, and those show the average annual temperatures over the last 150 or so years, with the colder temperatures in blue and the warmer temperatures in red. So the scientific imperative for business to contribute to climate change mitigation is pretty clear. At the international level, since we had the Paris Agreement in 2015, we've got 196 global parties that have committed to keeping climate change to a level that would prevent a temperature rise above 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that all has to happen by 2050. At the EU level, the EU did take a while to do it, but in 2021, it committed to becoming climate neutral by 2050, the first climate neutral continent. After 2050, it is committed to becoming climate positive, meaning that it will not only emit at a net zero level, but it will also essentially take emissions from other parts of the economy by removals or carbon capture or potentially even new technologies. Now, the UK was a front runner in terms of setting a climate target. In 2008, the UK set a target to reduce its emissions by 80% from 1990 levels by 2050. And in 2019, it increased that and it became the first major economy to commit to net zero by 2050. Now, how about in the Netherlands? Mariah, do you have something similar on the Dutch statute book as I'm describing on this slide?
Yes, Sarah, Jane, thank you. Yes, we do have the same ambition in the Netherlands. The Dutch Climate Act actually mentions the same target for 2050. Climate neutrality, net zero 2050.
Great, thank you. So let's keep that in mind. So turning now to some of the regulatory drivers behind transition planning. We've looked at the science, we've looked at the international picture at the state level, but as a business, what are the regulatory drivers that are pushing you towards embracing transition planning? So I promised to come back to the omnibus proposal, which I will do right now. So I don't want to linger on this too long, but it is really important context for the rest of the session. Back in November, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced that the Commission would propose to revise key legislation in order to reduce the reporting burden on companies by 25% in 2020. She said that they would look at the triangle of CSRD, CS3D, and the taxonomy regulation, and that would be with the aim of reducing redundancy, overlap, and bureaucracy in an acknowledgement that what they're asking businesses to do is too much. Having said all that, she said that the content is good, so there is no intention, at that time at least, to completely go back to the drawing board. There is a really good question, I think, in industry and in terms of the professional community of what is redundant and overlapping between these three regimes, because they do slightly different things. There's a lot of rumour and talk about what we might see from this omnibus proposal. One concrete thing that we do know is going to emerge over the next few weeks is that there'll be a proposal for a new size category of company called a small mid-cap. We don't know exactly what that will be, but in all likelihood, it will have between 250 and 499 employees. And normally we'd expect there to be some financial thresholds that go with that. That is likely then to be applied within the regime of, for example, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, potentially to take some companies out of the scope of the very onerous reporting obligations which currently would apply to them. Now, all that said, in the last week, there have been rumours that much more dramatic changes could be about to be proposed, and that could potentially include raising the employee threshold under CSRD to 1,000 employees, which would be more consistent with the CS3D scope. And that's something that some of the larger member states, including Germany and France, have been calling for. In terms of the process and the timetable, there is a big expectation that we will see a draft proposed text by the 26th of February, which is when this omnibus will be discussed by the College of Commissioners. But again, in the last week, it's been said that that might be pushed out to March. The reopening of these three level one, as we call them, the main text of the regulations would have to go through the normal legislative process. And that could take some years. We saw with CS3D, particularly including the transition planning requirements in that regulation, were very controversial. There was not a lot of consensus around them. Until that happens, all three of these laws remain on the statute book, and they all are enforceable to the extent that member states have already put them into their own law. And that's, as I said, why we're talking about the law as it remains today. We know much less about what could be proposed under CS3D. That's important for us today because, as we'll come on to, that's where the active transition planning requirements sit in the EU. But there is rumour that the transition planning requirements across these three regulations could be aligned. CSRD could also potentially see an easing of the reporting requirements. Now, potentially that could include on transition planning, but it is thought that climate will continue to be the core of CSRD reporting. So whether or not that will come off, we cannot yet say. So all that said, let's have a look at what CSRD and CS3D require of us as of today. These are two really important drivers around transition planning in the EU. Starting with CSRD. So CSRD is all about disclosure, indicated by that big transparency bubble at the bottom there. It doesn't force any behaviour change. You are perfectly at liberty to disclose that you don't yet have a transition plan, provided that you're comfortable with the other implications of that in terms of your stakeholders and any reputational consequences that that might have for you as a business. However, if you do have a transition plan, the E1 climate change standard does require you to disclose it. Now, typically, the E1 standard in paragraph 14, as I've copied out there on the slide, is quite simple, but it is supported by a number of very detailed data points. For example, you have to talk about your decarbonisation levers, about how you're going to fund the changes described in your transition plan, and what kind of governance arrangements are going to sit behind it. Now, notably, this is a particular category of CSRD disclosures which are derived from other EU legislation. And that means that everybody that prepares a CSRD report has to prepare some kind of disclosure against it. You either have to disclose your transition plan, you have to disclose that you haven't got one, or you have to disclose why, or rather that this transition planning is not material for you. Don't forget that under CSRD more generally, if you decide that climate is not a material topic for your business, then you have to include a detailed description of why that is the case. Now, moving on to CS3D, on the other hand. Now, the scope here is significantly higher. So we're talking about requirements that apply to a much smaller subset of companies within and outside the EU. These companies have an active obligation to develop a climate transition plan. They have to not only adopt a climate transition plan, but they also then have to implement a climate transition plan. And those are importantly two separate obligations. The transition plan has got to be compatible with the 1.5-degree warming goal within the Paris Agreement that we just talked about, also with the EU's climate neutrality goal by 2050, and also it must show how the business will limit its exposure to coal, oil, and gas-related activities. There are more specifications in CS3D around what the transition plan must include, and Mariah will talk about those in a second. Now, critically, the achievement of the goals that you set out in your CS3D transition plan are on a best efforts basis, meaning that the company needs to try on a good faith basis to achieve the intended outcomes. But it's an acknowledgement, really, that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is something that's not fully within the control of one individual company. As we've just said, it's more of a systems change that is not necessarily something that the company can achieve on its own. Now, a little bit more detail now around CSRD transition planning requirements. The Commission's advisory body, EFRAG, released a draft in the next of its series of implementation guidance documents, and this time their draft implementation guidance is specific to the disclosure on transition planning. It's very detailed guidance, and it's given that it's only responding to one single aspect of a much broader sustainability disclosure regime, maybe that underlines the importance of this topic. Now, for me, the guidance does slightly blur the line that I've just made, the distinction on the one hand between CSRD as a transparency regime and on the other hand, CS3D as an active obligation to introduce that climate transition plan. If you were to write a transition plan from scratch, the IG4 and transition plans would be a very good starting point. Despite that fact, we are further expecting EFRAG, as they indicated in the guidance, to issue a climate transition planning workbook. We don't know exactly what that's going to contain at the moment. And we also expect separate guidance from the Commission on implementing the transition planning requirements in CS3D. Just to highlight a couple of aspects of this guidance. So it really highlights and bakes in the concept of do no significant harm, which many of you will be familiar with from SFDR. It emphasises that although climate does need to be prioritised, that shouldn't be at the expense of other sustainability factors. So that could be biodiversity on the one hand, or it could be social aspects around the transition. So this notion of just transition, that you shouldn't just withdraw the source of people's livelihoods, for example, shutting down a coal mine or a mineral mine without somehow equipping them with to transition to a low carbon economy, whether that's by way of financing or new skills, meaning that they can acquire a different job that is compatible with the low carbon economy. Now, moving on to another sort of a supporting source around transition planning. Very recently, just a few weeks ago, the Platform on Sustainable Finance released a report on transition plans called Building Trust in Transition, Core Elements for Assessing Corporate Transition Plans. Now, the Platform on Sustainable Finance brings a slightly different perspective to this topic because it focuses on ensuring that the EU Sustainable Finance Framework is fit for purpose and it facilitates the flow of capital towards sustainable investments. The purpose of this report was, in essence, to advise the Commission on how it can use its existing framework to better facilitate flows of transition finance, using both the existing legal framework and also targeted policy interventions, as it called them. I think the PSF read the room pretty well when it talked about targeted policy interventions. It wouldn't be consistent with the overall push towards simplification to say that at this point we should introduce a whole new complex regime for transition planning. The report does stress the need to have Scope 3 targets, given that Scope 3 emissions are on average across all industries 11 times higher than a company's own direct Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So again, just highlighting a couple of points about this report. The report made 9 recommendations, and those are on the right-hand side of the slide. And it was guided through 3 principles around do no significant harm, consistency and feasibility, and transparency and completeness. So to highlight a couple of the recommendations, very interestingly, the PSF recommended that the Commission should develop a transition plan template for non-financial companies to create robust transition plans. It should be structured for easy integration with EU regulatory requirements, and it should aim to simplify reporting and improve comparability, not forgetting that part of the purpose of this report is for financial market participants to judge whether or not their potential investments have a credible transition plan. Alongside that, for that secondary purpose, they recommended that financial market participants should have access to a core elements checklist in order to determine whether the potential investee company's transition plan was credible. Another thing to highlight was that the PSF recommended that the Commission develop credible target setting criteria. They should provide guidance on selecting credible scenarios and also for setting science-based targets. Now, it's no surprise that they're recommending science-based targets. This has been a thing for quite some years, and the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, has been seen as the gold standard in this space. It's more recently faced some difficulties based largely on its decision to permit particularly high-emitting companies to use carbon credits to reach their targets. It was seen as a concession to those high-emitting and high-polluting businesses, and also a potential conflict of interest with those actually providing the carbon credits, resulting in the CEO stepping down last year. Nonetheless, this report does underline the importance of a science-based target. Now, I don't think anybody would support a proliferation of frameworks for setting science-based targets, but an EU-derived framework, knowing that this would be consistent with EU regulation, would potentially be quite helpful. Now, turning now to the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. This is an offshoot of the IFRS. So it's a global organization which was established by the IFRS. Its intention is to set a global baseline in sustainability reporting, and it's doing a pretty good job. So since it released 2 standards on sustainability disclosures in 2023, more than 30 countries worldwide have either adopted or in the process of adopting ISSB into their national reporting regimes, either on a voluntary or mandatory basis for all or some economic actors. The 2 standards that it's developed, is one on general sustainability disclosures called S1, and there is S2, which is on climate-related disclosures. The S2 disclosure standard is based very closely on the TCFD regime. It is centered around the same 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, but it's slightly updated and modified in places. It does contain a specific disclosure requirement relating to transition plans, so the entity must disclose any information about any climate-related transition plan that it has, including assumptions and key dependencies. Now, there's not a lot more than exactly that in the standard itself. So, question, how to comply with this, how to make a consistent disclosure. Given that it's based so closely on TCFD, you could have reference to the TCFD guidance on metrics, targets, and transition planning, which does include some really helpful tips and is the source of that graphic that I showed you earlier. The ISSB, however, is also formulating guidance to specifically address this disclosure requirement. There'll be a stakeholder forum later this month, and that will be based around the UK's Transition Plan Task Force disclosure framework, which I'll mention in a little bit more detail in a moment. That Transition Plan Task Force disclosure framework was adopted by the ISSB to form the basis of this guidance going forward. And as I say, we'll talk about that in more detail in a sec. Now, finally from me, UK requirements for transition plans. So we've talked all about the EU and the international frameworks to date. Mariah will talk about the Netherlands, but first just to touch on the UK. So we've got a few sort of different touch points for transition planning across the UK regulatory frameworks. As I said, we've had TCFD reporting on a mandatory basis for certain parts of the UK economy for a few years now. In 2021, listed companies, premium listed companies, were required to prepare the first mandatory TCFD reports. And since then, those have also been introduced for standard listed companies and some financial sector entities, including asset managers. Transition planning isn't explicitly referenced in the TCFD framework, but the strategy disclosure does ask the company to explain its plans for transitioning to a low carbon economy. The Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, which is the regulator for the most part of TCFD disclosures outside of the pensions world, does encourage people to have reference to that TCFD guidance that I mentioned a moment ago, but you're not strictly speaking required to reflect that in your reporting. On the other hand, the FCA has talked about strengthening its expectations for listed companies' transition planning disclosures, and it's also said that it recognises that most companies would benefit from additional clarity on what a good practice climate transition plan should cover, and that again potentially could be based on the work of the TPT framework. So there is an increasing regulatory focus on transition planning in the UK. And finally, since last summer, the UK has had a new government. So the Labour Party in its government election manifesto said that the government would mandate transition plans. So notably not disclosures, but actually active transition planning for listed companies and UK regulated financial institutions. It's not much more specific than that, but we could expect the scope to apply eventually to the same companies that are subject to TCFD disclosures today. More recently, in November last year, the Chancellor said that the consultation on mandatory transition planning would happen in the first half of 2025, but we have yet to see any sign of that and certainly no consultation. So we've talked here about explicit references to transition plans and about specific requirements, but there are some other relevant frameworks that I just wanted to give a brief mention to. That would include, for example, relevant to banks, the Basel III framework under the Capital Requirements Directive and the Capital Requirements Regulation. And in that context, the EBA has highlighted the importance of transition planning in the overall prudential planning for those types of entities for the management of long-term risks. The EU's revised emissions trading framework similarly requires that operators of high-emitting installations develop climate neutrality plans in order to qualify for free allocations. And I know that Mariah will come on to talk about that in more detail in a second. Now I'm going to hand over to Ronnie to talk to us about transition planning and how that is playing out in the courts in the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Sarah Jane. I'll be briefly discussing the current state of climate change litigation in the Netherlands and what that can tell us about what needs to be in your climate transition plan. First, I'll briefly touch on why the Netherlands is such a frontrunner in climate change litigation. I think there are several factors. One is that we have a relatively plaintiff-friendly class action system, which is beneficial for public interest litigators. We have rather low litigation costs. And what I think is very important, we have a flexible open norm in tort law that can also be used to fill in climate change related obligations. This is the unwritten standard of due care. And yeah, I think a last general factor is that the courts appear to be relatively progressive in the Netherlands and they take climate change very seriously. So these are some factors that may help explain why you may be seeming to hear all these things about climate change happening in the Netherlands. Can I?
Oh, that was
Okay, thank you very much.
Next slide, please.
Next slide, please. So I will shortly discuss I think the most important case by far on this topic against a private company, which is the case of Friends of the Earth against Shell. Now, as you probably have all heard or seen in the news, on 26 May in 2021, there was a groundbreaking decision by the District Court of The Hague. In this case, the district court gave the judgment that Shell had to reduce its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions with 45% in 2030 relative to its emissions in 2019. Now, this was a landmark decision and quite unexpected for most litigators in the Netherlands. So what was this based on? Essentially, the obligation was based on the on tort law, and it was based on the unwritten standard of due care. So this open norm. And what the district court did was it ruled that there's several soft law kind of instruments, such as the UNGP and the OECD guidelines. And the UNGP is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And the district court kind of ruled that from these soft law instruments, it follows that large companies must respect human rights. Human rights protect against dangerous climate change was the second step in the reasoning of the court. And so Shell has an obligation based on this kind of horizontal or indirect application of human rights to sufficiently reduce emissions to prevent dangerous climate change. This was the basis in the unwritten standard of due care that led the court to its decision. Now, this was not entirely new, because before the Shell verdict, we had a very important case against the Dutch government, the Dutch state. There was the Urgenda case. And in the Urgenda case, in the end, the Supreme Court ruled that based on Article 2 and 8 of the European Treaty on Human Rights, so the right to life and the right to family life, the Supreme Court ruled that the Dutch government, it first ruled that human rights protect against climate change. And second, it ruled that the Dutch state had an obligation to reduce its emissions with 25% in 2020 relative to 1990. And I think what is a very important aspect of the Urgenda case is that the reduction percentage, was based on the IPCC reports, so the International Panel on Climate Change, and on the projections of what was globally on average necessary to stay below 1.5 degrees. And so for 2020, this was 25% to 40%. And the Supreme Court ruled that the Dutch state had to at least achieve this 25% in 2020. So this was the first important case. And then the district court essentially ruled that the human rights could be applied in this kind of horizontal way. And the 45% reduction target was again based on the IPCC reports and on what was globally required on average to stay below 1.5 degrees. And so to round this up, the district court ruled that Shell had an obligation of result for its scope 1 and 2 emissions, and it had a best efforts obligation for its scope 3 emissions. Next slide, please. Naturally, Shell appealed this judgment. And as you have probably also heard in the news, in November, on 12 November, the Court of Appeal of The Hague gave its decision and overturned the judgment of the District Court of The Hague. And I think what is interesting with this judgment is, first of all, the Court of Appeal, to a large extent, followed the reasoning of the District Court. So it repeated the reasoning that human rights protect against dangerous climate change and that they could be applied in a horizontal way to a private company. And it reasoned that based also on this indirect effect of human rights, companies have a general obligation to sufficiently reduce their emissions. So until that point, the kind of normal footing, the normative footing, the Court of Appeal followed the District Court. But then the Court of Appeal decided that it would not impose a 45% reduction obligation. And the court distinguished here between scope 1 and 2 emissions and scope 3 emissions. The Court of Appeal rejected an injunction for scope 1 and 2 emissions, essentially because the own climate related targets of Shell for scope 1 and 2 were higher than the requested 45% in 2030. And the Court of Appeal deemed it sufficiently credible that Shell was on track to achieve those targets. So essentially, an injunction for scope 1 and 2 was rejected because the court ruled that Shell was already doing enough and following this kind of trajectory. So there was no danger of Shell not achieving this target. And for scope 3 emissions, the Court of Appeal ruled that it could not apply the general global average on a private company like Shell. And I think this was a very important ruling that gives us some information also about what applies to companies and should you adopt the globally required average. The Court of Appeal ruled that the portfolio, for example, of Shell is not a representation of the global average, and that it could not automatically be applied to a private company. And the Court of Appeal also ruled that there's insufficient consensus on what exactly can be expected of a company such as Shell. So these were, I think, two important reasons for rejecting, putting a reduction target on Shell. And so in the end, what guidance does this judgment give us? It's clear that at least currently there's not a hard obligation in the Netherlands to achieve this global average. And the court also gave an important reflection on the CSDDD and the obligation in Article 22 to adopt a climate transition plan. The Court of Appeal said that also from the CSDDD, it follows that companies have some discretion on choosing their reduction targets and on how they give shape to their climate transition plan. So in essence, I think the Court of Appeal realized how complex the question was and that it was not adequate to, in this situation, simply apply the global average. So the Court of Appeal did not give any reflections that can help us further with what you positively should do, but at least it indicated negatively what could not be requested from Shell in this situation. Now, finally, the Friends of the Earth can still appeal this decision to the Supreme Court, and they have until tomorrow to do so. It's still uncertain if they will, but tomorrow we will have more information if this is the definitive ruling on this case or if more might happen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. So I'm just going to briefly jump back in to describe the Transition Plan Task Force Disclosure Framework, because we're starting off this section around what makes a good transition plan. Hand over to Mariah very shortly. But this is sort of, as I said, because of the fact that the ISSB has looked at the Transition Plan Disclosure Framework and decided that it could potentially be good enough to form the basis for transition plan disclosures in the terms of its international framework and its global baseline, I think it's just worth knowing upfront what this framework is all about. So the Transition Plan Task Force was a UK body. It was convened a few years ago, staffed with experts, and it had a relatively limited mandate to develop this disclosure framework and to outline what it thought a gold standard transition plan would look like. It really has come up with something that's like a checklist for anybody that needs to draft a transition plan from scratch. It released its framework in October 2023. Then it was pretty quickly disbanded, and now we have the ISSB in June 2024 adopting its documentation into itself. So it's not quite been subsumed, but as good as. It focuses on these three themes that I've outlined in red at the top: the principles of ambition, of action, and of accountability. And then when you go below those principles into the disclosure elements and what they call sub-elements, you start to see some recurring themes with the things that I talked about earlier at the beginning of the session when talking about how we define a transition plan. So you've got things around the business model, around the strategy. You need to disclose around your funding, around your targets, and also around your governance. Now, as I said previously, there is also sector-specific guidance released by the TPT. Some of that is incredibly helpful. It does go into quite a level of detail. It includes, for example, things like decarbonisation levers. So if you're at the start of your journey wondering, actually, we do want to decarbonise, but we're just not sure how to go about it, then those sector-specific guidance documents are a really good place to start. So I'll hand over to you now, Mariah, to talk about other aspects of good transition planning.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah Jane and Ronnie, by the way. So an analysis of the world's largest 2,000 publicly listed companies suggested that 1 year ago, only 2.4% of companies globally have a detailed transition plan, and 30% have no transition plan at all. So in Europe, the analysis is slightly better. 3.4 of analyzed European companies in 24 have a transition plan, a detailed one, so to speak. And in 25, it shows that 4.1% of the largest European companies have a detailed transition plan. In the meantime, from our private equity partners, we know that on the other side, there's a lot of companies that do have a plan, but there's including targets, but there's less substance behind the targets. So, and although we may face a slowdown of reporting obligations, it's still a rather worrying result, I guess. And well, although I'm sure that a number of the companies who are represented at the other side of the screen will have detailed transition plans and have put loads of effort in it, the question, of course, is why, and when facing CSRD and CSDDD obligations in the near future, most companies do not have a plan at all. And as a former member of a team responsible for designing a transition plan, and as a lawyer, I would like to outline some main difficulties and hopefully give some direction. And it will also include a brief explanation of how the Dutch are trying to tackle this challenge. And I'm conscious of time, so I will try to speed up a little bit. The core article of the CSDDD, as you mentioned already, Sarah Jane, reads as follows: companies adopt and put into effect a transition plan for climate change mitigation, which aims to ensure, through best efforts, that the business model and strategy of the company are compatible with the transition to the limiting of global warming to 1.5 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement. So the overall imperative is clear. It should aim at limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement. The climate transition plan must include climate targets, decarbonization actions, investment and funding must be included, and also an explanation about the governance involved. So everything comes together in the plan, right? It's about changing the strategy, sometimes even changing the core business. It's about new products, financial consequences of it, the technology behind it, which often are innovative and new, and with all the uncertainties that come with it. And also, if new technology or even new factories are involved, then you see that permitting timelines, for example, are of extreme importance to assess when what results can be achieved in terms of climate reduction. So back to the overall imperative, it's about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And having that said, good transition plans require, of course, good targets. But what exactly is target setting in line with the Paris Agreement? We can ask ourselves, right? So how do we actually determine this? Can we find a basis in CSRD and ESRS E1? That's one of the things we dived into. And when you look at the next slide, yes, thank you. ESRS E1 under the CSRD, you will of course also see that Paris-aligned targets is at the core of your climate transition plan. It also states that greenhouse gas emission reduction targets shall be disclosed in absolute value, either in tons or as a percentage. But does this document really give you a true direction? I don't think so. And yeah, well, if you look at the directive and the ESRS, we see what you could call a kind of top-down method for assessing what must be done to reach the target, which must be in line with the Paris Agreement. And we also know from climate litigation, as Ronnie has already explained, that without further guidelines on target setting and without clear sector-specific and regional pathways that align with the 1.5 degree target, for an individual company, it's very hard or simply not possible to assess whether its plans are Paris-aligned, so to speak. So we also had a look at existing regulations. In a Dutch legal literature, following the Shell case, there was a concern. It was said by the authors, in the Shell case, it is being said that there's no clear target for individual companies. And then they have asked themselves, so what then is the emission reduction standard for individual companies? And the authors start by mentioning that the CSDDD does not contain an absolute reduction target for individual companies, as we have discussed. They also do not find a true basis in existing legislation, such as the EU ETS system and the obligation to draw up transition plans under the IED also provides no real support. Also, I think it's important that if you look at these regulations, they contain rules that are established for installations, while in climate transition planning under the CSDDD, we are looking at targets at company level and often at an international company level. So our conclusion is that from these existing regulations, we will not get to real individual target setting for an undertaking. On the other hand, we think if you are starting to get yourself to target setting, you should these rules should at least be at the beginning of your target setting, because everything must, as a minimum, fit into the goals of these directives. So please bear in mind, it's important to look at these regulations when you start the target setting experience. Also, when we look at European climate law and the Dutch Climate Act, there's no such thing, of course, as a reduction standard for individual undertakings. There is a national reduction ambition, and it's 55% or even 60% now in the Netherlands. And well, this is more like an anecdote, but very often stakeholders believe that this must then also be the target for individual companies. I have experienced that when talking with stakeholders about a transition plan for a company, they were of the opinion that the national greenhouse gas reduction target of 45% meant that the company involved had to reduce by 45%. Well, also in the Shell case, it has been determined that that is not how it works. So let's take a closer look at the Netherlands. On slide, yes. And we see that the national target for emission reduction is actually used for individual target setting nowadays. To be more specific, the Dutch Climate Agreement, resulting from the Climate Act, is taken as a starting point for greenhouse gas emission reduction target setting. In the climate agreement, different targets have been set for different sectors. And I'm now going to elaborate a little bit more on the industrial targets. And we see some examples of percentages for individual companies. Yes, so for the large contribution of the industry, the Dutch government has invented the so-called tailor-made approach for the largest greenhouse gas emission emitters in the Netherlands. The Dutch tailor-made agreements with industry aim to accelerate the reduction of CO2 emissions and enhance sustainability in the Netherlands. These agreements are designed to support energy-intensive companies in achieving their climate targets even faster than required by existing regulations. And some key purposes are accelerated CO2 reduction, sustainability and innovation, economic and environmental benefits are also involved in these agreements, and of course, the government support. Overall, these tailor-made agreements are a strategic effort to make the Dutch industry future-proof, environmentally friendly, and economically resilient. And in documents you see coming up, agreed in the tailor-made approach, we also see the first individual targets companies use, as these targets are being negotiated with national governments. And we see rather representative outcomes of individual target setting by companies. And behind those numbers are real climate transition plans. We see that, for example, a steel industry states that their goals are very ambitious, but they comprise 25% of the Dutch 2030 CO2 reduction target for the industry in total. And in practice, when I dived into some of these transition plans, I have actually experienced good transition planning and good target setting. And I have experienced it works the other way around. instead of taking the Paris Agreement as a starting point, what is, well, kind of a top-down approach, you should use a bottom-up approach to determine individual company settings. You have to look at what is possible, what is achievable, and what is feasible in terms of timelines, and then you start building your climate transition plan. And then after all, it is up to the national governments to aggregate the plans and see if the overall percentages align with the Paris goals. So just as an illustration, and I think we can now go to the next slide. Yeah, if you look into these companies, you will find a broad range of approaches, different baselines and new technologies that need funding. But the question, of course, is, are these in line with the Paris Agreement? And as I have said, I do not believe this is up to the individual undertakings after all, which is also underpinned by the Shell decision. So not only from a practical, but also from a legal point of view, I would encourage individual companies to really focus on what is possible instead of only what is looking good, and not get fixated by the Paris alignment aspect of it, but see what is possible from a technical, financial, commercial, and legal perspective. This should lead to a robust 2030 target and the 5-year steps that are required thereafter. And I was also pleased to see that in the very recent report of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance, as has been mentioned by you as well, Sarah Jane, that public authorities should encourage companies to think of transition plans as an opportunity for robust planning and transparent communication, and not as window dressing or tick-the-box exercise. It underpins the thought that it's important that it's the results that count in the end. And hopefully, this will now also be encouraged by the competitive compass and the future omnibus legislation. The report also included relevant recommendations as that the target should be based on sector-specific and regional pathways, or that international pathways aligned with the 1.5 target should be adopted before we can come up with individual target setting. So as long as these guidelines and pathways are not in place, my recommendation would be to take this bottom-up approach, prepare a climate transition plan, and in doing so, prepare for what is coming up top-down in terms of obligations, because this will be rather unstable in the time ahead of us. And as a final remark, I think it's important to realize that it's for the national governments to determine alignment with the Paris goals in the end. This was what I wanted to share with you.
Can I briefly add one comment to the, I think, very interesting point of Marije, that you should really look bottom up. I think also from a litigation perspective, this is the most sensible strategy, because this takes into account what you actually can do, and this is what you write down. And yeah, basically writing down very ambitious targets of which you have no idea yet if they're feasible and if you can achieve them. This is a very dangerous strategy, because of course these transition plans will be used in litigation, and if you have very ambitious targets, you'll have to later explain, if you're in court, why you were not able to achieve them. And we've also seen this in the cases so far.
So that's the Dutch way so far.
Good. Well, I think then, thank you, Marije and Ronnie, for that. I can say still quickly, by the way, a few words on governance structure. We're talking about bottom-up and top-down, but in respect of corporate governance and responsibilities, I think I would still or need also to emphasize that within the company, a top-down approach is also quite important. And that is what I want to share a few words with you about. We've also received some questions about this before the seminar, and thank you very much for sending those in. So what I want to emphasize is that the content of your climate transition plans should be a top management issue, what we say a board priority. In your governance structures, your management board is the one responsible for the climate transition plan. Likely, This will be under supervision of a supervisory function. That's either in a two-tier system, the supervisory board, or in a one-tier system, your non-executive directors. And also, if you have in your company installed a audit committee, then we see under the CSRD that describes that this audit committee should include the sustainability reporting in its review and consider if the internal reporting structure of the company is sufficiently addressing the company's risks profile and if management can be considered to be in control. And the climate transition plan is, of course, a plan that covers all that we have been covering today, but is also something that you there report on and take responsibility for. We see that there's a number of large companies who have mandated their financial reporting department to lead on CSRD reporting and setting up the required plans. And where this is a good idea from a bottoms-up perspective, you should be aware that top-down you should be part of that. Because we also see that specific ESG committees are formed, and we consider that that is, of course, not wrong. But to state the obvious, the management board should ensure that it plays an active role to align the contents of the climate transition plan, which is target setting, as we've just discussed, but target setting for the future. With the overall strategy, this should be within the overall strategy of the company. Management should be in control of setting those goals for the future and therewith the strategy of the company, and should avoid that the climate transition plan gets control over your strategy. You want to consider to have a specific chief executive function addressing ESG issues going forward. Perhaps the chief CSR or chief ESG officer. Climate transition plans will be subject to scrutiny of, for example, your financing banks, and likely also to scrutiny of other third parties, for example, NGOs willing to initiate legal action. Please remember what Ronnie was just telling us earlier in respect of climate change litigation. But also, possibly younger employees may take an interest in your ambitions for the future. So thank you, and please back to you, Sarah Jane.
Thank you very much, Jacques, Ronnie and Mariah. I'm very sorry to say that we actually have run slightly over. Thank you so much, everyone, for bearing with us. We don't have time to take your questions, but thank you to those who've submitted them. And to the extent that we have your details, we'll be very happy to reply to them. Thank you for joining us again. We hope it's been useful to you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Travers Smith or to Houthoff to discuss transition planning further, or if we can assist you on your transition planning journey. We do very much hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.